Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who redefined organized power in America. Known for his vision, intelligence, and leadership, Luciano transformed chaos into structure, bringing order to the underworld and shaping it into a lasting empire. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to bring you even more fascinating stories from the underworld. Now, settle in and let the story of Lucky Luciano guide you into the night. He was Salvatore Lucania, born in Lercara Fritti, Sicily, November 1897, to a family that knew hard work and few spare coins. His father chased steadier wages across the ocean, and the boy followed in 1906. Their new world was the Lower East Side, a squeeze of tenements and wagon wheels, where bread lines ran long and children carried pails of coal up dim stairs. He learned English fast enough to trade, not to write essays. He liked school only as long as it didn't slow his hunger. By 12, he spent more time working than studying, running errands, hauling goods for pennies, counting change until numbers felt like small, steady lights. The streets taught laws no classroom covered. Bigger kids shook down smaller ones for lunch money. He wasn't built to be pushed. He found a trick. Pay a kid with fist to walk you home. Soon, he refined it. For a nickel a week, he would make sure no one else took your nickels. It wasn't kindness. It was management. The idea that a fee could stop trouble stuck to him early. That little system, simple and cool, was his first blueprint for power. He slid into card games that swelled under awnings. The city's sounds were a constant drum. Trolley bells, vendors chanting prices, dice rattling against wood. He met sharp minds in that noise. Jewish, Italian, Irish kids, who didn't care where anyone came from, as long as they played a clean hand and showed up when called. Among them were Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, two names that later would echo through lounges and courtrooms. The first was calm and exact, a mind like a ledger. The second moved fast, laughed hard, and did not scare easy. Together they made a trio that understood money first, pride second. He drifted into the 5 Points crowd, the loose coalition of neighborhood toughs that rose and fell with city elections and police shifts. Arrests came early. Street fights, a petty theft or two, a narcotics charge in 1916 that put him behind bars for a short stretch. It wasn't a proud line on a resume, but it told him something crucial. Cells are small, courts are cold, and judges listen when your lawyer knows the right hands to shake. When he walked out, he did not announce a moral awakening. He adjusted his methods. Fewer scraps in alleys, more meetings in rooms where someone poured coffee and heard you out. Arnold Rothstein crossed his horizon in the late 1910 seconds, a sharp dresser who spoke softly about risk as if it were a science. Rothstein's gift was teaching that crime dressed like commerce could grow quieter and wealthier than any wild spree. He showed the young man how to treat chaos like inventory, how to buy silence by the month, how to keep ledgers of favors as carefully as cash. That mentorship polished the edges. It also widened his field. He began to see beyond blocks to boroughs, beyond friends to networks. Then the country changed its rules. Prohibition arrived in 1920, a dry law that poured rivers of money into anyone who could fill glasses without attracting the wrong kind of light. He joined the bootleg world not as a brawler but as an organizer. He dealt in routes, schedules, and payoffs. He helped set up channels from distilleries in Canada and rum ships off the coast. He recruited drivers and guards who could keep quiet and stay sober. He did not brew in bathtubs. He built pipelines. The risk was constant raids, hijackings, honest cops who refused envelopes. To stamp out setbacks, he focused on reliability. Deliver on time, cut losses fast, and instead of ruling by screaming, treat crews like contractors. If they liked working with you, they kept you rich. New York had old bosses before him, men who wore their Sicilian codes like medals and thought alliances with outsiders were insults. Joe, the boss Masseria, ruled one slice of that world. Aligning with him was both shield and trap. It protected business but demanded loyalty to a style that treated modern partners as liabilities. He stood near Masseria while keeping his ear close to Lansky and Siegel, plus other crews, Irish labor brokers, union men at the docks. That web was risky, but useful. He learned to be a bridge among worlds that rarely traded smiles. He balanced friends like a juggler. Frank Costello, a born lobbyist with a velvet tongue, handled political links, slot machines, and club licenses. Vito Genovese, colder and more direct, enforced debts and announced consequences without raising his voice. Together they made a triangle: policy, muscle, and strategy. His role at the top was to keep revenue flowing and tempers low. He prized convenience. If a police captain needed cash to stay blind, he found out how much, paid it on time, and reminded everyone that missed payments were more dangerous than hasty fights. With success came jealousy. Rivals wanted lids clamped on their city. He kept traveling to meetings where groans of old grudges filled the air. He suggested partnerships that would split profits without bullets. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes it provoked men who felt tradition slipping. One night in 1929, a car stopped. A ride turned sour, and he was taken for a lesson. The beating left marks, including the droop of one eyelid, that made his stare seem half asleep and fully awake. He lived, which strengthened the nickname bullets had flirted with for years. He liked to say luck helps, but planning pays better. He returned to business with a cooler heart. If they wanted him gone for pushing unity, then unity was his answer. He took care to sit with gang leaders across lines drawn by heritage, teaching them the simple math. A quiet city makes more money than a city on fire. He found new ways to keep the federal gaze soft spread operations, move meetings, use payphones, keep names out of ledgers, write nothing you wouldn't want read aloud in court. This wasn't just to stay free. It was to prevent rash men from tripping stable revenue. The law never stopped watching. The 20s last years brought questioning, surveillance, raids that netted drivers but rarely him. He preferred not to carry a gun. He preferred not to be seen anywhere near trouble. He entered clubs after they were secure and left before the room heated up. His crimes were not secret, but they were insulated. Bootlegging, extortion, illegal gambling, loan schemes that pushed debtors into obedience, labor rackets that turned warehouses into private toll roads. Those were his trades. He didn't print advice on how to do any of it. He simply arranged the players and took the largest share for synchronizing the show. In 1930, the city shook with a feud that would make newspapers run hot type for months. The Castellamarese War rose from a tangle of grudges between Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, a stern figure from the old country backed by younger blades fed up with Masseria's taxes and tempers. Businesses suffered when trucks burned, men vanished, and warehouses changed hands overnight. He hated that kind of heat. Profit shrank under gun smoke. He floated peace talks where older men saw traps. He kept telling them, "This is a country where retail runs on repeat customers. A war makes everyone a first-time buyer, with no money left for seconds." While he spoke as a mediator, he studied the chessboard. The city had more than two sides, and he knew where alliances could bend. He also knew that the generation that crossed the ocean as children wanted a different world than the one built by men who clung to rules from villages where death resolved disputes. He started pushing the idea of a board of directors for the underworld, one that trimmed ego and elevated revenue. Instead of an emperor, a council. Instead of pride duels, arbitration. It sounded clinical, almost corporate, which was the point. Crime dressed as an industry draws fewer lightning bolts than crime dressed as a feud. None of that talk stopped the bloodletting. Drivers still vanished, ambushes still happened. Police found empty cars with doors open, no prints, only newspaper clippings folded in back seats. Through it all, he kept his face smooth and his mouth shut about loyalties. He didn't curse Masseria in public, didn't praise Maranzano either. He had coffee with both and nodded along as each asked for a future where the other no longer breathed. Sources later claim that he began shaping an end to the conflict, not by declaring a side, but by deciding that both leaders had made themselves too costly to keep. These are allegations, echoed in memoirs, indictments, and testimony of informants. He almost never gave answers on the record. That silence built myths and fear in equal measure. Prohibition's repeal crept closer by 1933. But in 1930 and 1931, the speakeasy pipeline still paid the bills. He quietly widened gambling, a stream that carried fewer federal hounds than liquor. He let Costello plant slot machines, wherever town bosses would allow them, and made deals with local power brokers far from Manhattan. New Orleans, parts of Florida, upstate resorts all got calls or visits from men who spoke in low tones about licenses, protection, and shares. He believed in national reach before most of his peers even thought about the distance between boroughs. Behind careful manners, the pressure built. Maranzano's camp recruited young gunmen with a zeal for old codes. Masseria's network frayed under debts and distrust. Detectives compiled stacks of notes on both camps. Politicians fretted that the feud would embarrass a city trying to look modern after a crash that had burned fortunes on Wall Street. He kept moving through this weather as though the storm had purpose. Meals were brief, car rides were short, pivot points approached. He wasn't an artist with a pistol, not a swaggering figure who posed for photos with spats and silk ties. He was faster with introductions than with orders to shoot. Yet people died because of the machine he built and the battles he chose. That truth never left him. He had a way of looking away not from responsibility, but like a surgeon who must cut to save a patient. He even used that kind of language, calling murder a fix or a settlement in private. In public, he refused to speak of it at all. His line was always the same. He sold services people wanted and kept disorder low. The paper trail of extortion tells another story. So do court files from later years that named him as boss of bosses, even though he tried to erase the title from the vocabulary of his world. Night after night, he visited clubs where horns sang and dancers tapped. That elegance masked meetings set at exact minutes, with back rooms timed, so no two visitors crossed. On a winter evening, he sat with Masseria for a calm dinner, the kind where drinks are poured in steady rhythms and conversation holds no sharp edges on the surface. Afterward, he stepped into the breeze and lit a cigarette by cupping the match in his hands. He exhaled, eyes heavy from the old beating, mind quick as ever. A problem as big as a city still comes down to one man opening a door, one man deciding which call to answer, one man's quiet nod in a room where no one raises a voice. That was how he lived that season. Unarmed, neatly dressed, working the angles, arranging factions into a future that would keep money moving and headlines tame. Beneath the calm, the city trembled toward a breakpoint that would end an era, erase a throne, and put in its place a structure that looked, to his mind, more honest about what it was. A business with bylaws he could enforce without parades or grand speeches. He stepped into a dark sedan, the door clicked shut, and the driver pulled from the curb, leaving only a faint fog of smoke, and the memory of a man who could make violence vanish behind the clean lines of a deal. Spring in New York carried a tense chill that no coat could chase away. The city's feud had become a tax on every truck, every delivery, every club that wanted to keep champagne on tables and songs in the air. He moved through that weather with a deliberate quiet, still meeting men from both camps, still repeating the same pitch: end the chaos, let business breathe. In April 1931, one path closed. After a calm meal at a seaside restaurant in Coney Island, the older boss who had ruled with heavy dues and heavier pride was cut down by gunmen who slipped in and out in minutes. Newspapers drew a straight line to him. In truth, evidence was a fog of witness whispers and later recollections, but the effect was clear. The old guard lost its loudest enforcer. Power never leaves a vacuum. The rival leader stepped forward, declared himself the supreme arbiter, and began to remake the underworld with rules he thought would last. He gave the young organizer his own family to captain, but kept a throne above everyone, a revival of the old boss of bosses idea. On paper, the structure looked neat. In practice, it put a target on anyone who refused to kneel. The new monarch eyed him as a future problem and, according to multiple accounts that hardened into accepted history, plotted to remove him. Warnings reached him through friends who heard things in hallways. He didn't argue. He adjusted. In September 1931, men posing as federal agents arrived at the ruler's office and, within moments, ended that reign. No parade followed, no speeches. Just a quiet shift as the city exhaled. What came next was the signature of his career. He refused the crown as a single title, and pressed for a council. He helped create a board that would set policy, settle disputes, and share profits in ways that reduced the urge to settle scores with bullets. New York would be divided into 5 permanent families with defined territories and bosses who were expected to attend meetings like executives. Seats were given to leaders in other cities, with Chicago the most prominent partner, so that national deals could find balance without public wars. Reporters later called it the Commission. Whatever the label, its purpose was pragmatic. No more one-man empires that demanded tribute. No more feuds that turned restaurants into headlines. Money over ego, arbitration over vendetta. He also swung open the doors to partners who never fit the older, stricter mold. He worked easily with Jewish financiers like Meyer Lansky, with Ben Siegel in fast-growing markets out west, and with Irish intermediaries who ran docks, unions, and fleets of trucks. The blend expanded reach and soothed city politics, because more groups had a stake in stability. Where previous generations prized lineage and rigid codes, he prized results and discretion. If a deal made revenue reliable and kept police pressure down, heritage mattered less. It wasn't reform in any moral sense. It was an upgrade in management that made illegal ventures look, from a distance, like ordinary commerce. Prohibition's end in 1933 threatened to collapse one of his main revenue pillars. He had already anticipated the shift. He nudged his people toward gambling, bookmaking on sports, numbers, games in neighborhoods, roulette and cards in private rooms, and he expanded control over unions where a friendly steward could turn a warehouse, a loading dock, or a garment floor into a toll gate. Frank Costello greased relationships with machine politicians who loved tax streams as much as anyone. Slot machines and charity games found homes in counties where a handshake still meant more than a contract. Other crews took charge of violent enforcement when talk failed. An outfit the press later branded Murder, Incorporated, run by men like Lepke Buchalter and tied to enforcers such as Albert Anastasia, served as a subcontractor for punishments approved at higher levels. He kept his distance from the mechanics of brutality and focused on policy, but the system relied on the threat of force to function. His public face grew polished. He appeared in fine clubs, traveled with care, and adopted the look of a businessman who knew luxury but preferred quiet. He cultivated lawful investments and friendships with owners of restaurants and entertainment spots that paid their taxes and offered front-row seats to information. Behind the scenes, extortion, illegal loans with impossible terms, and control over rackets that targeted working people continued. The pitch to a legitimate boss was simple. Pay a percentage and goods move, wages stay steady, and trouble avoids your doors. Refuse, and deliveries stall. Equipment breaks, and lines of credit evaporate. He justified it to himself as order. To families who lost paychecks or business owners squeezed into despair, it was coercion in a nice suit. With the council in place, discipline improved. But not every associate embraced restraint. Dutch Schultz, who had built fortunes in beer trucks and policy bets, fumed at the young prosecutor climbing fast in Manhattan, Thomas E. Dewey had made his name by chasing rackets with a mix of patience and theater, and he seemed to build cases out of thin air and stubborn witnesses. Schultz wanted him gone and pushed hard for permission to eliminate the threat. The organizer in the tailored suit said no. Killing a spearhead for reform would heat the city past boiling, bring unified public disgust, and invite a blitz of raids. The board voted against the plan. Schultz talked on as if he didn't need consent. In late 1935, he was gunned down in Newark. That incident, too, came without graphic spectacle in our telling, only a blunt truth. When contracts turned on high heat, it was usually to prevent a larger fire. If Schultz's removal was meant to cool things, it failed. Dewey didn't blink. He pivoted. Instead of chasing him for gambling or union pressure, he went after the vice markets that had long been dismissed as street-level noise. A team led by prosecutors and investigators, including a determined assistant who tracked patterns that others ignored, began to connect brothel managers, collectors, drivers, and the shadow figures behind them. Women who had been coerced into that life, as well as some who worked in it for lack of options, were interviewed for months. Logs of phone calls, rooming house ledgers, and car hire slips became a map. His name appeared often enough to give a target shape. He denied any control over those networks. The prosecutors believed otherwise. When subpoenas tightened, he traveled south to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a spa town where many figures hid in plain sight near mineral baths and quiet hotels. Local officials treated visiting gamblers and fixers as valuable tourists. New York asked for help. After a brief tug of jurisdiction, he was arrested and, following a series of legal moves that made front pages, extradited back to face trial. The courtroom filled daily with reporters. Witnesses entered with their faces turned from cameras. The charges centered on compulsory prostitution organizing, profiting from, and protecting brothels through threats and payments. He and his lawyers insisted the case was built on fear and unreliable testimony. The jury did not agree. In 1936, he was convicted on dozens of counts and given a sentence of 30 to 50 years. The verdict stunned some citizens who had long thought him untouchable. Others asked why it had taken so long. Dewey became a star, rising quickly into higher office on the strength of that win. The defendant kept his composure, as he always did. But prison swallowed nearly every luxury he had built. He went first through intake at a downstate facility, then up to the steep walls and hard winters of the state's northernmost penitentiary. Dannemora was known for tight routines and few comforts. The long ride north felt like a step into exile. Friends outside couldn't fix sleeping quarters, couldn't erase the clang of count times or the cold that seeped into bones. Inside, he adjusted without dramatics. He kept to schedules, read newspapers, stayed healthy, and watched the rhythm of the place with the same study he once applied to docks and clubs. Guards saw a prisoner who obeyed rules. Other inmates saw a man who didn't brag. He did not hold rallies in the yard or issue orders in open view. He remained what he had always been, a coordinator who preferred quiet channels. Letters traveled both ways through the approved routes. Lawyers kept up appeals. He styled his narrative as a miscarriage of justice, repeating that he had never forced anyone into vice, that his wealth came from gambling and legitimate investments. The state kept him where the sentence required, unmoved by speeches. While he sat in a cell, the world he had shaped did not stop. The council kept meeting under cautious protocols. Gambling continued in back rooms and hotel suites. Union pressure remained a way to steer contracts and deliveries. Police units raided when they could, but the structure he had designed absorbed shocks better than the old empires ever had. Chicago set its own pace. Smaller cities looked to New York's template, turning loose crews into LLCs in all but name, with treasurers and mediators and rules against unnecessary noise. Some historians argue that the very professionalism he championed created a sense of inevitability that shielded his organization even while he was locked away. Others note that it also drew public outrage toward a system that looked too much like a state within a state. His story, at this middle point, reads like a manual of trade-offs. He sought order and got it, but the cost was a lattice of threats wrapped in polite rituals. He avoided wild gunplay, but he built an enforcement economy that depended on fear. He rejected the single king model, but he became the strongest voice in a room designed to quiet revolts. The law judged the whole man by the vice case because it was the one prosecutors could prove in court. Whether that charge reflected the core of his empire or simply its most vulnerable wing remains debated. What isn't debated is the sentence's impact. It removed him from daily command at the exact moment when legal liquor had reshaped criminal portfolios, and when national politics, heading toward war, would soon change the stakes again. In interviews granted through attorneys and in remarks delivered to reporters during escorted moments, he kept his image trim. He said he was a gambler who had tried to keep the peace in a rough trade. He said violence made no profit and that he had tried to unite rivals so workers didn't get caught between trucks and picket lines. He never described himself as a benefactor. He was too realistic for that. He simply insisted that without his kind of management, the streets would have been louder and poorer. Families who buried sons disagreed. Business owners who paid off collectors shook their heads at the idea that any protection could be called peace. Time passed slowly. Appeals failed. Snow piled along the yard fence, melted, and returned. The man who once stepped in and out of limousines now lined up for meals and waited for whistles. Visitors came when rules allowed. Old partners sent money to his family and kept certain promises. New faces rose outside young bosses, who had only met him at a distance, now spoke as if they had always been in the room. He had designed a machine that could run without its engineer, and that was both his pride and his trap. He could not stop it if he tried. He could only hope it would not betray the principles of restraint he had preached when he had his seat at the table. Even so, influence is a strange traveler. Ideas continue moving when their authors sit still. The concept of a commission, the practice of arbitration, the habit of blending illegal and legal fronts, those didn't vanish with a prison term. They endured in shipping contracts, in casino deals far from New York, in the way cash flowed across state lines to keep everyone satisfied. Law enforcement adapted as well. The state learned to follow paper, not just people. To attack finances, not just foes with pistols. The chessboard got smarter on both sides. He could read that in each article, each official remark taped to the bulletin board outside the mess hall. By the late 30s, his name still carried weight, but the center of gravity had shifted. He was no longer the daily caller who set agendas. Other men made moves, and they made them with an eye on headlines and mayors. The country stared across oceans toward conflict. The docks in New York, so vital to shipping, looked like they could decide more than profit. That reality would, before long, pull his name back into rooms he hadn't seen in years. For now, he walked the yard in a steady loop under gray sky, kept his counsel, and waited for a chance that would arrive from outside his fences, delivered by a government worried about enemies far beyond state lines. Winter gave way to wartime fear. In February 1942, flames raced across a proud French liner docked on the Hudson. The ship toppled during the effort to save it, and headlines shouted sabotage even before investigations finished their first notes. Whether that fire was an accident or a signal, it sharpened a question that kept naval officers awake. Who really governed the piers, the warehouses, the forklifts, the tugboats, the fish stalls? Trucks rolled only when certain foremen nodded. Barges unloaded only after certain collectors took a cut. The man in the northern prison had helped build that influence long before iron gates closed behind him. Officials who needed the docks quiet now wondered if someone like him could do in days what months of patrols could not. An unusual alliance formed. Naval intelligence officers moved discreetly through city offices, sat with prosecutors who knew the street, and asked longshoremen's leaders how to stop theft, fires, and stoppages that could delay supplies to soldiers. Joseph Lanza, who dominated the fish market, came under pressure to assure loyalty. Meyer Lansky surfaced as a translator between straight world officials and men who would never talk to a uniform. The name of the prisoner in Dannemora entered those conversations. He was not present in any bar on the river. He did not stroll a single pier. Yet the argument was simple. If the person who had persuaded rival crews to accept an arbitration board could ask them to guard the waterfront instead of skimming it, ships might leave on time, and rumors of sabotage might fade. Arrangements followed that still invite debate. Reports say he agreed to lend influence in exchange for improved confinement and consideration later. He was moved from that frostbitten fortress near the border to a milder facility where visits were less formal. Guards noted changes in routine. Trusted intermediaries made rounds between union halls and government desks. The message carried across the water was short. Strike ends, pilfering stops, fishermen keep watch, gates lock at night, no torches on the pilings. Patrols continued. Federal agents still walked the fences. What changed was the mood around coffee stands at dawn. If a problem surfaced, a call reached someone who could calm it before a cable snapped or a pallet vanished. No one raised a victory flag. No official bulletin said a convict had secured the harbor. The Navy credited its own units. City detectives praised tighter patrols and daylight inspections. The prisoner's friends whispered that his word counted. His enemies said the docks were always safer after winter because cold keeps thieves indoors. Years later, investigators combed the files and settled on a phrase that captured the mix of myth and fact. He gave assurances, not orders. Whatever the exact measure of his help, pressure lifted from the waterfront enough for command to feel comfortable with the next step. The country's armies sailed, the war turned toward Europe, and the Pacific and the city's piers kept working. In 1946, the governor who, as a young prosecutor, had sent him upstate, signed a commutation on the condition that he leave the United States. The day came without fanfare inside the walls. The warden read the papers. He gathered his few things, nodded to men who had watched his walk for a decade, and took the ride south. Photographers waited outside with bulbs ready, curious whether the famous inmate would scowl or grin. He did neither. He kept his face composed, spoke softly to attorneys, and repeated the line he had held since indictment. He had never run vice houses. He had stood only for gambling and opportunity, and he wanted a chance to live quietly. The law kept its end of the deal by cutting years from his term. It held to the other part as well. Immigration took custody, placed him on a ship, and sent him back to a country he had left as a child. Italy in 1946 was a landscape of rubble, ration cards, and soldiers footing their way home from a lost war. Naples carried scars that reached from port to hillside. Clotheslines crossed alleys like flags of survival. He stepped onto a dock where boys sold cigarettes one at a time, and mothers counted bread slices. Police who despised his reputation trailed him from the first hour. They knew who he was from photos and files sent by American counterparts. City halls ordered him to check in often and discouraged him from lingering at busy cafes. He rented rooms under his legal name, Salvatore Lucania. He dined early, tipped waiters, and learned to watch the faces of plainclothesmen who pretended to read newspapers whenever he walked by. People came anyway. Old country cousins brought small requests. Visitors from the States arrived under the cover of vacations, sat with him in lobbies where ceiling fans turned slowly, and hinted at opportunities. He listened more than he spoke. When asked by reporters whether he planned to rebuild, he smiled without showing teeth and said he was finished with fast money. Italian authorities remained unconvinced. They detained him on occasion for questioning about black market rings that moved flour, fuel, or cigarettes. Nothing stuck. He knew that open management was impossible. He also knew the structure he had helped design beyond the Atlantic could run without daily instructions. Influence for him had always worked best as air rather than bricks. Months later, a plan to stand closer to his old world took shape. Havana offered warm weather, nightclubs, and a government that, for a price, tolerated outside investors. Through friends with political ties, he secured travel documents despite his deportation status. He flew under his given name and landed on an island that pulsed with music and money. The hotels glittered. Roulette wheels spun. A familiar circle gathered under chandeliers at a high hotel above the water. Leaders from New York, Chicago, and smaller cities shook hands, cut slices of future revenue, and assigned oversight for new ventures. That December gathering would be remembered as a moment when the underworld renewed its national charter, far from the gaze of American law. At those sessions, gambling came first. Havana's floors would be refitted with strict accounting to prevent skim by managers who confused house money with pocket money. Western prospects came next. Ben Siegel's desert project had soaked cash and invited jokes from skeptics, yet some still believed that a resort in the sand could work if steady hands replaced careless ones. He argued for patience, then listened as others tired of delays and complaints. Beyond casinos, a darker topic surfaced in side rooms: narcotics. Some present wanted to expand shipments. Others feared the heat that such a trade would bring. The man in exile held his cards close. Historians still debate whether he backed any plan personally. What is certain is that, years later, law enforcement tied that very city and networks that reached into Sicily and Marseille to surges of heroin on American streets. His name appears in those reports as a suspected broker. He always denied it. Havana's comfort did not last. Washington learned that a deported figurehead had taken up residence 90 miles from Florida. Pressure came through diplomatic cables, through customs officers, through polite threats that medical supplies and other goods would slow unless the island corrected its guest list. Cuban officials visited his suite, apologized for the inconvenience, and handed him papers that ended his stay. He boarded a plane and returned to Naples in early 1947, not as a man beaten but as a player pushed off stage by forces larger than any council could manage. Back in Italy, he resumed the pattern of careful days. Quiet breakfasts, short walks, meetings only when necessary, no bragging. News from the States carried both triumph and sorrow. The long experiment in national coordination continued across racetracks, policy banks, union halls, and resort towns. Frank Costello polished his image as a statesman of nightlife, a man welcome at dinners where fewer questions were asked. Vito Genovese, who had absconded to Italy during the war and then returned, began to set his own ambitions in motion. Albert Anastasia kept an aura that suggested consequences for anyone who strayed. In Los Angeles, the bright, troubled project that had embarrassed investors finally drained patience. In June 1947, Ben Siegel was shot at a house in Beverly Hills. The killing decapitated a dream as much as a man. Police did not solve the case. Friends mourned privately. Commentators later wrote that the leadership had withdrawn protection after too many broken promises and too much missing cash. He, asked for comment from afar, said nothing. Italian officers increased their watch after the headlines from California. They raided apartments, seized address books, and photographed every diner who lingered near his table. He kept moving, never far, never predictable, always within reach of a phone that rang only for true friends. When questioned, he described himself as retired, a reader of newspapers who liked good coffee and clean suits. Yet his fingerprints appeared wherever old partners needed a referee who had seen every kind of disagreement. When a dock contract in South America involved a company tied to New York, someone in Naples received a visitor. When a casino deal in Europe needed assurance that shares would be honored, another visitor arrived. He still sought order, still calmed egos, still believed that rules prevented waste. Public opinion in America split along familiar lines. Some columnists condemned the commutation that had sent him overseas rather than leaving him behind bars. They argued that a wrong turn in policy let a mastermind continue work by mail. Others insisted that the war demanded unconventional alliances, that harbor security had improved, and that removing him from the streets had been a net gain regardless of where he slept at night. He rarely answered criticism directly. When he did, he reminded listeners that he had obeyed the conditions set by the state, and that he was an immigrant who had built businesses legal and illegal in a country that loved winners until they became too famous. As the decade closed, a new kind of spotlight swung his way. A Senate committee began touring the nation to study organized gambling, racketeering, and the way money twisted local offices. Televised hearings made bosses household names. Detectives, mayors, bookmakers, and former enforcers took oaths before cameras. He watched from across the ocean as witnesses argued over whether he remained the hidden director of a vast enterprise or a symbol without levers to pull. His answer stayed steady. He was out, he had paid with prison and exile, and any business that still bore his imprint did so because ideas outlived their authors. What cannot be denied about that period is the breadth of his reach. Even when he lived under surveillance, he had built a network that wrapped illegal gambling rooms in policy, that treated union power as a revenue stream, that taxed trucking routes, that negotiated peace in cities where war once seemed constant. He committed crimes that bruised workers, drained small businesses, and held community life hostage to quiet threats. He also resisted moves that would have incinerated entire neighborhoods in retaliation for one man's pride. He lived in contradictions, a gentleman with brutal tools, a planner who hated chaos but accepted fear as lubrication, a manager who pretended to be only a gambler, even as judges read the long list of charges from earlier years. In Naples, nights settled soft over the bay. Music drifted from windows. He leaned on a balcony railing and listened to scooters on the street below. Letters arrived from New York, Chicago, Miami, Havana. Some brought greetings, some carried requests. He sorted them in his head and smiled at the memory of a commission that still met 3,000 miles away in hotel rooms, chosen for their neutral wallpaper and reliable elevators. He had wanted a world that ran like a company, less noise, fewer funerals, steadier cash. He had mostly achieved it. The cost to others had been high, a truth he did not speak aloud. Silence remained his strongest habit. He kept aging in that rhythm: visits, meals, newspapers. The law pressed him now and then, hoping to catch him ordering a shipment or installing a puppet in a foreign casino. Nothing concrete appeared on charges Dex could bear. Allegations swirled about heroin lines arcing from Marseille to New York, with Sicily as a refueling stop. Scholars still fight over his role in those currents. Some say he was a broker who matched supply to demand and skimmed enough to stay rich. Others say his exile clipped his reach and left him as a symbol that made lesser men feel taller when they used his name. Either way, the legend grew. He had become an illustration for lawmakers and storytellers who wanted to explain how a city once run by street bosses matured into an empire that preferred spreadsheets to smoke-filled saloons. The sea kept breathing below his window. He watched tugboats pull freighters into harbor and thought of a winter day when a great liner burned and fell on its side. That image had nudged the Navy toward his name and had started the chain that set him free and sent him away. A man can live a long time on consequences he never intended. He finished his coffee, folded the newspaper, and prepared for another day of being both present and absent in the life of a country he could no longer enter, a country whose shadows still followed his steps across sunlit stones. By the turn of the new decade, he had become a fixture in Neapolitan mornings, a man in a crisp coat at a cafe table, a newspaper folded to the financial pages, a half smile for the waiter who already knew his order. Police shadows trailed him at a polite distance. They wrote up notes about who sat down, how long the talk ran, whether hands touched shoulders at parting. He returned the courtesy by moving through the day at a modest pace. No rushing, no fuss, never raising his voice. He seemed to enjoy the rhythm of a city healing from hunger and rubble, even as letters from across the Atlantic kept his mind on a machine that still spun without him. Television antennas began sprouting on rooftops back home, and with them came hearings that turned back rooms into public theater. The Senate committee led by Estes Kefauver took the country on a tour of the shadows bookmakers, union fixers, gamblers, and the strange commerce that turned city contracts into private cash. He watched from Italy, sipping bitter coffee while familiar names flashed on screens and in headlines. Frank Costello, smooth as marble, had to sit under lights while the cameras showed only his hands as they shifted on a witness table. That detail, just the hands, not the face, made the moment even more famous. Asked what he had given the country, he answered in a rasp that he'd paid his taxes and tried to be a good citizen. It sounded like a punchline to some, like a shield to others. Either way, the hearings gave every living room a vocabulary for the underworld. The word syndicate left law books and entered kitchens. His name hovered at the edges of those sessions as a kind of blueprint. Witnesses suggested that the national system had been shaped by a man now eating gnocchi in Naples, that the council Model 5 families in New York, partnerships with Chicago and other hubs, arbitration, instead of drama, had set an enduring tone. He couldn't testify. He wasn't welcome in the country anymore. He didn't need to. The map the committee drew was his in all but signature. The disgrace cut two ways. It made life harder for his friends still in the United States, and it burnished his legend as the planner who had turned chaos into a quiet industry. The law adjusted its aim as well. Instead of chasing only illegal clubs and numbers writers, federal agents turned to a commodity that traveled invisibly and demanded tiny storage but carried violent consequences wherever it landed. Reports from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger used his name often, claiming that from his exile he had helped direct or at least bless a linkage between Marseille labs, Sicilian couriers, and American distributors. The alleged route chemists in France, ships to Mediterranean ports, helpers in Sicily, parcels hidden among ordinary cargo, became the spine of a national scare. He pushed back through lawyers and interviews, saying that he disdained any trade that pulled young men into addiction, that he had told associates to stay out because the heat would melt all their other businesses. Historians and detectives still argue over those claims. Some believe he steered the traffic while maintaining distance to avoid fingerprints. Others believe exile cut his lines more than his enemies admitted. What is beyond dispute is that the charge followed him for the rest of his life. The Italian state made sure he never forgot he was a guest they didn't want. He had to report to police at regular intervals. He needed permission for trips outside the province. When he tested those limits visiting Rome for a few days at a high-end hotel, for instance, plainclothesmen appeared in the lobby within hours and asked him to return to Naples. He complied. He always said yes softly and left before the exchange turned into a notice. The pattern became routine, a photograph against a wall, a signature in a ledger, a sigh from a captain who wanted him gone but had nothing fresh to charge. A new presence softened his days. Her name was Igia Lissoni, a performer with a gentle face and strong will, the kind of woman who could share silence without making it feel like a weight. They walked along the water, slipped into small restaurants, and built a life with careful steps. She kept his posture from hardening into constant watchfulness. He kept her shielded from the loudest parts of his past. Friends noticed that he seemed both lighter and more protective. Police noticed too. They scribbled that the American kept company with an artist who made him smile. It was the rare note in a surveillance file that read like a blessing. Back across the ocean, rules designed to minimize firefights began to fray. Time and ambition erode even well-built scaffolding. Vito Genovese had returned from his own time in Italy with hunger. He had once played deputy for the man in Naples and had learned the art of waiting. In 1957, a would-be successor to the old diplomacy moved to remove Frank Costello. A shooter greeted Costello in the lobby of a midtown building and fired. The target survived with a wound and, shaken, stepped back from leadership. No one prosecuted the mastermind. But the message was unmistakable. The quieter, handshake-heavy style that Costello and his patron abroad preferred could be pushed aside by a colder calculus. That same year, another pillar toppled. Albert Anastasia, formidable, known in whispers as a man you did not cross, fell in a midtown barbershop. The scene made lurid headlines, but stay with the cooler truth beneath them. It meant that New York was changing bosses in daylight, a violation of the old expectation that high-level shifts happened off-stage. Carlo Gambino ascended, a manager with patience and a gift for staying out of the papers. Some would say the city traded thunder for fog. In Italy, reading about these shifts, he surely felt the sting of someone watching his blueprint rewritten by men who loved the structure but ignored the restraint. The shock that followed carried a rural address. In November 1957, top figures drove to a hilltop house near the village of Apalachin, in upstate New York, summoned under the notion that national matters needed in-person settlement. The host, a local businessman who liked to entertain, had his lawn lined with expensive cars. A state trooper spotted the gathering, remembered earlier tips, and set up roadblocks. Executives of the underworld scrambled across hedges, stumbled through fields, and were rounded up in suits that didn't love mud. The raid exposed a roster that read like an index of the era. Leaders from New York, New Jersey, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Florida. The country now had photographs of men the hearings had described only in testimony. The official line that there was no national syndicate wilted in the face of those roadside IDs. His name appeared in coverage as the absent architect, the exile whose framework had made such a congregation inevitable. Reporters asked whether he had blessed the meeting. Allies denied it. Enemies suggested that without him mediating, egos crowded a room that should never have been that full. Whatever the inside story, Appalachian set off a wave of arrests, deportation orders, and renewed surveillance. It also pushed some bosses to retreat into deeper privacy. For him, it offered a dark kind of vindication. He had always said that if people treated the life as a business, they could avoid circus scenes. Instead, the world had been shown a parade on a country road. Italian authorities tightened the net again, if only to show their counterparts across the sea that they were not idling. He was detained, questioned, released, and denounced in editorials. None of it altered his schedule by more than a day or two. He went back to the same cafe, nodded to the same waiter, and flipped to the same columns in the paper that showed exchange rates and shipping notices. He took calls in lobbies, never in rooms. He wrote short letters. The discipline that had made him effective in New York, the habit of moving lightly, leaving few marks, now served him as armor. The late 50s brought both a legal earthquake and personal grief. In 1959, the same rival, who had tried to rule New York through fear, saw a courtroom turn against him. Vito Genovese was convicted in a narcotics case and given a long sentence. Gossips claimed the conviction had been greased by false testimony. Others said the evidence stood on its own. Either way, a man who had seemed to stride above the law was now locked away. A correction that satisfied those who believed that short-term violence had wrecked too many plans. That outcome also kept pressure on him abroad. Agents insisted that if narcotics had sent a titan to prison, then the man who supposedly designed the routes must be as guilty as anyone. He answered as he always did. The accusation left a stain he could not scrub. But it did not fit the version of himself he had tried to become. Then came the loss he could not argue with. Igea's health began to fail. Hospitals replaced seaside walks. He stayed by the bed, as machines hummed, and nurses moved with soft steps. Friends who knew him only as the man who never winced saw a face that could not hide pain. She died in 1958. The funeral was small. The mood held tight. The photographs kept private. Afterward, he became even more careful. He ate alone more often. He wrote fewer letters. He stayed indoors when rain started. The man who once ran a city by scheduling meetings to the minute now scheduled the smallest rituals with the same precision because it kept his mind from turning too long toward absence. Meanwhile, the old network kept adapting. Las Vegas turned from a question into a fact, shaped by new investors who craved clean books and less excess. Florida tightened rules, but could never quite shut the doors. Havana, once the jewel that could have been his comeback, spun into politics that no partner could manage. Miami picked up the slack, and Caribbean islands offered alternatives when laws proved fussy. Wherever votes mattered, political brokers learned that being seen with certain faces would cost them dearly. The life receded from front pages but never vanished. It had been designed for exactly this kind of unglamorous survival. He did not stop taking visitors. Trafficante from Tampa passed through Europe now and then. Men from Montreal and Marseille came to sit for an hour and then leave without a handshake to steady the exit. When newspapers wrote that he had blessed some new venture in South America or scolded a young boss in New York, the truth was usually simpler. He granted audiences, listened, and said a few words about keeping order, avoiding sensational moves, and making sure everyone left the room with a reason to stay friends. Whether anyone followed the advice depended on pride and the price of patience that day. A small ritual summed up that stage of his life. He collected city maps. Neapolitans found it funny. Why would a man who had walked every block of the waterfront need paper guides? But those maps were for other places. Buffalo with its factories, Cleveland with its river bends, Chicago with the switch yards, Miami with boulevards that seemed to stretch forever, New Orleans with the long docks, San Juan with the bright hotels lining the water. He spread them on a table and traced routes with his finger, then folded them neatly and put them away. It looked like nostalgia. It was also habit, the mind of a coordinator who kept imagining where trucks moved, where phones rang, where money changed hands, even if he would never travel those roads again. He had kept clear of memoirists for years. In the late 50s and early 60s, he began entertaining the idea of telling his version of events, not out of vanity, but to settle the balance sheet as he saw it. What he had intended and what had happened, the lines he believed he had drawn and the ones others crossed. Writers came and went, some more serious than others. He showed patience for those who let him speak, without pushing his words into sensational shapes. He had spent a lifetime avoiding headlines. He was not about to sell himself back to them as a brand. All the while, he could not escape the contradiction at the center of his legacy. He had turned loose crews into companies, insisted on arbitration so that households didn't have to duck when trucks passed, and pushed leaders to think in terms of budgets and calendars instead of oaths and vendettas. He also ran rackets that pinned working people to debts and made shopkeepers pay for calm that should have been theirs for free. He loathed random bloodshed, yet he accepted that certain acts were the price of keeping the machine clean. He told friends he was a businessman who preferred quiet solutions. The court record called him the organizer of illegal enterprises that bled cities. Both statements contain pieces of the story. Neither cancels the other. From a balcony, he watched laundry flutter and ferries trail white lines across the Bay of Naples. The sea erased and redrew those lines all day, a pattern he understood. Back in New York, one generation was aging out, another settling in, a third waiting. He had taught them to settle disputes without setting the sky on fire. They had learned that lesson as long as pride didn't flare. When it did, events like the Midtown attacks and the Upstate fiasco reminded them that rules were only as strong as the men who obeyed them. He breathed in the salt air, closed the paper, and went inside. The day had the same structure as the previous one. A call after lunch, a visitor at dusk, a final walk to a corner where he could look up the hill and down to the quay, then home before midnight. He remained a paradox to the last line of that decade, a deportee whose silhouette still landed on conference room walls in a country he could not enter, a refined figure in good suits who had spent his prime turning illegal markets into dependable revenue, a man who wanted calm and profited from forced calm, a strategist who hated attention and became an emblem. His world had changed, and yet, in essence, had not. Police still filled notebooks. Politicians still held their noses or held out their hands. Families still hustled a second job to cover bills. Somewhere, a table was set for a quiet talk that would prevent an ugly one. Somewhere else, an ugly one was already starting. He could see both scenes without leaving the square, and if you had asked him what he thought about the balance of it all, he would have given you the same answer he gave in better days. Make it run on time, make it pay, and keep the noise low enough that tomorrow means something. The new decade opened with a pale sun spilling over the bay, ferries tracing slow white wakes, and a man in a trim coat leaning into the morning like it was a well-rehearsed tune. He had a corner table, a folded paper, and a routine that soothed nerves his old life had frayed. A pair of plainclothesmen took the same seats each day on the opposite side of the square. They didn't bluster. They watched, wrote, and waited. The notes all said some version of the same thing. The deported American rose early, met a few visitors, made short calls from hotel lobbies, and kept his voice low. He fit the city without ever belonging to it. Across the ocean, the climate turned sharper. The fiasco upstate in 1957 had pushed officials to acknowledge a national network, and now the justice machinery spun with new energy. J. Edgar Hoover's shop issued lists of names. The Attorney General's office began touting plans that treated rackets as systems, not stray crimes. Agents who had once chased bookies now followed bank accounts. The story of his arrangements, built back in the bootleg era and refined through counsels and compromises, became a template for prosecutors who wanted to show how quietly an illegal economy could nest inside a modern city. His own name moved through those files like a watermark. Reports claimed he was still the invisible hand that kept far-flung pieces aligned. Others argued that exile had clipped his lines and left him more symbol than director. Italian police took no chances. They required frequent check-ins. They discouraged travel. When he asked to visit Rome or Palermo, a phone call would arrive asking him to return to Naples. He complied because conflict wasted time, and time was the one thing he could count on as his friend. Havana's casinos had fallen to a revolution that treated roulette tables like a rival government. Friends from Florida and Tampa passed through Europe, bitter and calculating, looking for new locations where cards could turn without soldiers turning them over. He listened, recommended caution, and reminded them that clean books and polite behavior bought longer leases than flashy openings. He had been expelled from the island years earlier, under pressure from Washington. Watching that glittering city slam shut confirmed a rule he had always preached. Keep national politics out of your business, or your business becomes national politics. While he sipped coffee and kept his schedule neat, the allegation that had shadowed him since the late 40s returned with new ferocity. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics insisted that heroin routes threaded through ports he knew well, that chemists in Marseille and couriers in Sicily had backing from men whose respect he commanded. Italian officials searching for leverage leaned on the same premise. Agents from the United States flew in, shared notes with their counterparts, and invited press coverage that made him a headline again. He didn't shout. He stated, as he had before, that drugs brought heat that would burn every enterprise within reach, that he had told associates to keep out, and that he had neither ordered nor profited from those pipelines. Some believed this stance. Others thought it was the old posture distance as armor. Whatever the truth about that trade, his long record needed no embellishment to fill a courtroom. He had already been convicted of organizing and profiting from vice houses in the 30s, a case that removed him from New York for a decade. He had spent the 20s and early 30s building liquor lines during Prohibition, taxing trucking routes, shaving union votes to steer contracts, and overseeing gambling from back rooms to resort floors. He had paid officials for blind spots, threatened holdouts with financial ruin, and watched as enforcers delivered messages to those who confused independence with immunity. He had built a council to curb vendettas but still approved punishments when negotiation failed. He later poured attention into casinos, slot concessions, and city licenses that lived in a twilight between legal and not. That ledger gambling, extortion, labor pressure, illegal liquor, the brothel system that his trial spotlighted was already enough to fix his place in infamy without adding a gram more. Even so, the narcotics claims did not fade. A Corsican connection made headlines. Seizures at docks fed the narrative. Journalists found it irresistible to write that the old architect in Naples had combined old-world kinship with new-world shipping to turn powder into profit. He answered with some version of a single sentence. He had argued for restraint his whole life, not reckless heat, and that business depended on calm, not an avalanche. He could not control what others did with his name. He could only repeat his line and hold his ground. His days were otherwise ordinary by design. A barber came to his apartment rather than have him sit in a shop window. A tailor visited twice a year with chalk and pins. He tipped the doorman. He read exchange rates before politics. He kept up with sports in the papers because odds told him how the public felt, and public mood mattered more than laws on most days. Visitors came in ones and twos. Some were old friends with thinning hair who had once pulled up to midtown hotels in new sedans. Some were younger men with too much confidence in their voices. He gave the same talk he'd given in every decade. Make it run without noise. Stick to the compromises. Don't chase headlines. Don't threaten officials in ways that force them to act. As always, some listened and some didn't. He looked after the few people he considered family. He made sure rent got paid for relatives who needed time to get back on their feet. He sent small bundles to old associates in worse condition than they liked to admit. He kept lawyers paid because paperwork was the strongest wall in his life since deportation. After losing Igea, he turned affection into maintenance, keeping an apartment tidy, ironing his own shirts on quiet afternoons, polishing shoes the way a sailor looks after a deck. Rituals filled the spaces, grief leaves. The shadow of Appalachian lingered, though not because of the spectacle itself. The real damage had been simpler. It showed law enforcement that their target had become a management class. They started reading ledgers with the same attention they once gave street corners. The IRS turned more aggressive. State commissions chased illegal slots out of counties that had once welcomed them. Wiretaps, still primitive by later standards, picked up enough names to make intimidation harder. And yet, for all the new tools, the system persisted. It had been designed against shocks. A boss could fall, and the calendar would still tick. A warehouse could get raided, and a different shipping door would open. He was proud of that durability, even as he knew exactly how many small businesses had been bent to keep it. In 1960, he went through a round of short detentions as Italian authorities staged a show of force. He was taken in for questioning about currency violations, about visitors whose passports suggested plans beyond tourism, about rumors that he had tried to buy his way into some export arrangement. Nothing stuck hard enough to hold. He went home the same day or the next, hung up his coat, and returned to his chair by the window. He was aging, but he was not fragile. He walked without help, never wore his fatigue on the street, and held his gaze on anyone who tried to read him like a file. Writers started calling more often. The world had discovered an appetite for first-person accounts of famous criminals, who now seemed almost antique, compared to the louder figures in post-war headlines. He had no interest in stunts. He would not take money for speeches. He did, however, warm to the idea of shaping one careful narrative that would present his version of a life he thought the papers had mangled. Over months, he tolerated interviews from a producer who wanted to develop a film. The man came with translators, notebooks, and a manner that reassured rather than provoked. Sessions ran short by his rule. He expected patience. He corrected small errors with precise dates. He insisted that certain legends were nonsense and that others were merely fits of pride dressed up as leadership. The prospect of a movie tickled a small part of him he rarely fed. Not the part that craved attention he had spent years hiding from that, but the part that wanted the record to show that he had been a builder, not a bully, and that he had pushed his world away from pointless wars. He would never put it like this, but he believed the story of restraint mattered. He did not pose as a reformer. He knew what his rackets had done to families and storefronts. He simply wanted to explain why he thought a structure with rules was less cruel than chaos. Meanwhile, back in the United States, one quiet shift had become permanent. Las Vegas no longer looked like a booster's joke. Resorts printed money and learned to manage their own scandals. Tax receipts softened certain political objections. Chicago, Cleveland, and New England outfits placed men in hotel offices instead of bar booths. The very order he had sold to his peers in the 30s had matured into a hospitality economy that needed suits more than soldiers. He took satisfaction in that, even as he understood that the original seed money came from extortion and fixes. Success is complicated when you know exactly how the first floor was paid for. In Naples, the police kept at it. They visited his building with professional consistency, never late for the appointments they set for him. He kept a small calendar and marked the dates like a dutiful student. He did not test their patience. They occasionally searched his rooms. They found clothes, a few gifts, a box of photographs, letters arranged by year, and those maps he liked to unfold and study. No strong boxes, no stacks of cash, no ledgers full of quotas. He never kept business in drawers after a life spent teaching others to leave paper trails to legitimate companies, not to themselves. The old friends who visited brought stories heavy with irony. A rival who once made himself loud with threats now sat in a federal cell, broken by a case he swore was a frame. Younger men who bragged about their clever new angles learned that quietly chasing long-term money still beat inventing fresh trouble. Policymakers talked about anti-racketeering laws that would target entire organizations rather than picking at the edges. He smiled at that. In his private arithmetic, the law was finally admitting what he had understood in his 20s, that the enterprise was the crime, not just the act. By late 1961, the film idea crystallized into a plan for a formal meeting. The producer would fly to Naples. They would sign papers that set out rights and boundaries, arrange a schedule, and in theory, lower the temperature around his name by turning rumor into a controlled narrative. He told a small circle that he wanted the opening to show a city rather than a face. He described a shot of New York waking subway doors, bakers pulling racks into light, office workers stepping into steam rising from grates because that was the real stage on which his life had played out. A modern city humming along while crews like his smoothed or roughened the flow. He spent the last weeks of that year and the start of the next in the same steady rhythm cafe, walk, visits, short calls. He had his suits pressed. He scheduled a haircut. He went through a drawer and removed a few old clippings he no longer wanted to see and placed them in a bin for burning. He washed his coffee cups by hand. He slept with the window cracked to let in the sea's faint hiss. In January 1962, he asked a driver to be ready on a particular morning. He planned to go to the airport, shake hands, and sit down with the visitor. He didn't fuss. He never fussed. He set his hat on the table by the door, checked his watch, and smiled at the simple satisfaction of keeping an appointment in a world that had once tried to turn time into a weapon. On that morning, Naples moved at its usual pace. Streetcars clattered. Porters stacked luggage. Agents waited with folders and questions, sure that the famous exile would reveal a sliver of himself in the bustle. He stepped into the daylight with the same neat economy that had carried him from the Lower East Side to rooms where men decided which battles were necessary and which were vanity. The car pulled away from the curb. He looked out at the bay, blue as enamel, then faced forward. He had prepared himself for a conversation about memory, about what to own and what to let drift. He had no way of knowing that the story he wanted to direct would, within hours, belong to other voices and official pens. For now, there was only the road, the airport ahead, and the old habit of keeping calm even when he felt the world's eyes lining the path. The airport smelled like fuel and new paper, a thin scent of ink from the newsstand mixing with coffee steam at the counter. He stepped from the car in a dark suit that fit like habit, hat in hand, eyes steady, the sea air following him up the curb. Agents in plain clothes waited on benches, pretending to talk about soccer while they watched every tilt of his shoulders. He had kept the appointment on the dot, as always. The producer had flown in from abroad with a folder and a plan to turn memory into film. They shook hands. Words came in low tones, the opening courtesies of men who intend to set ground rules before anyone brings out contracts. A dozen people saw an ordinary greeting and would later try to read it like a secret code. What happened next was simple and final. He faltered, one step backward. A hand reaching for the air, as if it were a railing. People stood. The circle widened, then closed as officials moved in with quiet urgency. An ambulance took him away. Headlines filled themselves. By the end of the afternoon, the police posted a statement that left no room for dramatic theories. A heart attack had ended the life of Salvatore Lucania, known in America by a name the papers had made a brand. Whisperers would always claim poison or plots. Investigators kept the record clean. The cause was natural, sudden, and undeniable. News traveled faster than the ambulance. In New York, phones rang in apartments where former partners had grown used to caution. In Chicago, a manager who had once argued with him over table shares paused in a doorway and said nothing for a long time. In Miami, a man who collected hotel bills stared at a television in a lobby and remembered advice spoken 2 decades earlier. Keep the noise down, keep your promises, and pay on time. 1,000 small circles felt the same nudge an era had closed. The face that had never smiled for cameras had left the frame for good. Police sealed his rooms in Naples long enough to walk through and write down what they found. It was the opposite of a crime novel. No stacks of cash, no coded notebooks, no wall maps with string. A wardrobe of good suits, a small box of photographs, a drawer of letters arranged by year, theater stubs he had kept from evenings he enjoyed, maps folded like pressed shirts. Plainclothesmen stood at the window and looked at the bay he had watched every morning. They left with a small list and a larger question that could not be answered with a receipt. How much of a city's order had lived inside one man's habits? Arrangements for the funeral moved from desk to desk. Family members asked that he be buried in the country where he had made his fortune and his enemies. Officials who had refused him entry in life agreed to accept him in death. The irony was lost on no one. A service took place in Naples, quiet, respectful, a few flowers in front of a framed photograph that had avoided smiles. Then the coffin crossed the ocean. People stood at a distance in Queens, hands in their coat pockets against the winter air, and watched as the box was carried into St. John's Cemetery. Old colleagues came in dark coats, more careful than mourners usually are, stepping away from cameras. The name on the stone was his birth name. Even in memory, he preferred the ledger to the legend. After the burial, the story widened into the balance sheet that had built his reputation. In the beginning, there was a nickel plan on a schoolyard. Pay a small fee, and bullies stop bothering you. That small trick stretched into an adult scheme protection money that turned neighborhoods into toll roads where invoices were paid in fear. During Prohibition, he organized liquor routes like a wholesaler, arranging suppliers, trucks, warehouses, and payments to keep doors from closing. When the dry law ended, he shifted the machine toward gambling. Policy games in back rooms, bookmaking on sports, roulette, and cards under chandeliers. He treated gambling as a steady stream that government would tolerate as long as it remained quiet and greased the right gears. He pushed into unions, not to help workers but to control how freight moved and which contractors got the job. A foreman who answered to his people could stop a truck with a phone call. A loading crew loyal to his circle could turn a dock into a tariff booth. He kept the garment district on a schedule that served his accounts, took a percentage from construction, taxed delivery routes, and made sure that strike talk found him first. All of this depended on officials looking away. So envelopes were passed, charities were funded, and favors were counted like currency. Restaurants that wanted peace signed deals, nightclubs that wanted a license paid fees that didn't show on any city ledger. The point was never flame and thunder. The point was smooth, predictable gain. Violence sat in the background like a locked tool chest. He did not glory in it, but he did not pretend he didn't need it. The underworld of his maturity relied on enforcers whose names filled headlines later. Anastasia in New York, Buchalter in another corner, men whose crews delivered consequences when bargaining failed. In the bootleg era, when old country codes collided with new country money, he made choices that shaped the map. The murders of Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano in 1931 cleared away two rulers whose demands he believed were choking profit. Did he pull a trigger? No. Did he benefit from outcomes he had the most to gain from, and that his allies believed necessary? History says yes, with the caveat that his skill lay in arranging turns rather than making the final move himself. He almost never spoke about those days. He believed the proof lay in the shape of the city afterward. 5 families with defined territories, a council to arbitrate disputes, an end to a title that put one man above the rest. Some crimes became the core of his record in courts, not just in rumor. The 1936 conviction for orchestrating and profiting from brothels remains the legal judgment that slammed shut his life in the United States. Prosecutors pieced together witness testimony, ledgers from rooming houses, and phone records to show a system in which women were managed, money was collected, and officials were kept docile. He always denied coercing anyone, calling himself only a gambler. The jury didn't believe him. He served nearly a decade in state prisons before wartime deals and harbor fears opened a path to commutation and exile. The sentence stands as the formal judgment against him, even as debates continue over who told the truth on that witness stand. The allegation that defined his later years involved powder, not cards or dice. Authorities in 2 countries insisted that he had a hand in heroin lines that ran from Marseille to Mediterranean ports and across the ocean. They said his ties in Sicily and his sense for logistics made him an ideal broker. He countered that he had warned colleagues to avoid that trade because it scorched anything it touched, and that his money came from gambling and investments that at least had a public face. The argument never ended. Seizures at docks, court cases against other men, and confessions from couriers fed one side. His distance, his lack of incriminating records, and the practical logic that drugs attracted the worst kind of heat fed the other. Scholars still argue in print. The files will never settle it completely. There was also the wartime episode that made him, briefly, a partner to the government he had spent his life evading. After the waterfront fire in 1942, naval officers wanted docks free from sabotage and theft. Through intermediaries like Meyer Lansky and union figures who controlled key markets, assurances were arranged. The docks calmed. Ships sailed. Years later, the state granted him freedom on the condition that he leave the country he had tried to own without holding title to anything. He kept his side of the deal and boarded a ship to Italy. He never returned except as a body in a casket. The last project of his life, setting the record down in an authorized way, outlived him. A dozen years after he died, a book appeared under a grand title that promised the inside story. It claimed to be his own voice as told to the producer he had met in Naples that final day. In those pages, the man confessed to plots, endorsed the heroin business, and explained murders in a tone that some readers took as gospel. Critics, including respected historians and lawmen who had chased him, blasted the book as a smooth fraud, a blend of half-true anecdotes, public information, and inventions. The debate over that volume became a debate over the man himself. If you believe the book, you saw a mastermind giving his last speech. If you doubted it, you saw a canny figure being posthumously used to sell stories. Many who met him remembered a code with 2 lines. Don't invite attention and don't waste time on grudges. He wanted a world where the cash register rang without headlines, where a union leader was a negotiator rather than a martyr, where judges believed they were cracking down, while envelopes ensured that deliveries went out on time. He wore good suits and treated kindness as lubrication rather than charity. He could speak gently to a small cafe owner on Monday and send a cold message by Friday if the payment didn't arrive. He saw no contradiction. He considered both acts tools, one chosen after the other failed. That view left scars in neighborhoods that had to pay for quiet, and it left a record of fewer public wars in a period that might have burned much hotter without him. He made a business out of middle ground. Between the street and the boardroom, he built a bridge and collected tolls from both sides. He wouldn't have used that image, but it fits the ledger. Judges, prosecutors, and union reformers learned to follow financial trails because he had shown that violence could be replaced by contracts written in rooms without windows. He didn't invent the basic trades, liquor, gambling, vice, protection, but he packaged them in a way that made them look to the untrained eye like normal commerce. That camouflage hardened the work of law enforcement and made possible the later legal changes that treated entire organizations as defendants, laws that arrived after his death but were shaped by the kind of enterprise he had refined. In the days after his burial, newspapers ran 2 kinds of columns. One presented a monster whose smile hid ledgers of pain. The other described a manager who cut down on explosions and preferred meetings to reprisals. Both found a portion of the truth. He took money that wasn't offered freely, bent unions to serve private interests, bought protection from people elected to protect everyone, and signed off on punishments that left families grieving. He also kept his world from erupting whenever pride wanted to put a match to it. Cities rarely get heroes in that line of work. They get results they can count, or scars they can't hide. His legacy is both. Years later, a tourist walked through the Queen's Cemetery and paused at a stone with his birth name. Wind pushed at the trees. The city hummed beyond the fence. The visitor thought about a boy paying a nickel for safety, a young man writing down delivery times for trucks loaded with bottles, a seasoned organizer telling angry rivals to sit down and divide a map rather than stain it. He also thought about shopkeepers who signed envelopes because the alternative was broken windows and closed doors, about dancers and drivers caught up in vice networks they could not steer, about union members who lost votes they never knew were stolen. The ledger remained complicated, even after the ink dried. In the end, the line that stayed with people who had met him was his manner, not his threats. Soft voice, careful clothes, a way of standing that suggested he had already thought through 3 possible exits from any room. That poise had fooled many into forgetting what paid for it. The last look most strangers had of him was a photograph in a paper taken on a January afternoon in Naples. The first look most neighbors ever had was of a polite man at a cafe table with a newspaper folded to the market pages. Between those images lies the blueprint of a system that turned vice into schedules and muscle into management. The man is gone. The pattern he favored, order over drama, profit over pride, stayed behind. For better in some ways, for worse in many more. The city that made him both possible and inevitable kept moving, as it always had, carrying both the music from dance floors he protected and the quiet debts he created. Wind moved the cypress tops over his grave, while the city on the other side of the fence kept its pace, subways exhaling, delivery doors groaning open, office lights clicking on one by one. He was gone, yet his name still worked like a key that opened conversations in precinct rooms, union halls, hotel suites, and newsrooms. Detectives pulled old files and wrote fresh memos that tried to summarize a life that had refused to be drawn in straight lines. Former partners sat at quiet tables and said little. Young reporters wrote with urgent certainty. Older ones wrote with wary restraint. Memory took its first pass at turning a man into a chapter. Within months, a new witness carried that chapter into the spotlight. In 1963, a small-time soldier serving time for a prison killing decided to talk. Joseph Valakai sat before senators, television cameras rolling, and told a story about an organization he called Cosa Nostra, its rituals, ranks, and rules. He sketched a map of cities, identified bosses, and most importantly for our tale, pointed to a turning point when chaos gave way to coordination. He named the Long Island-born prosecutor who had sent the architect of that change to prison. He named the architect himself. Valakai said the council model had replaced a single throne, that the five-family plan in New York had stabilized the field, and that the man now buried in Queens had set the tone. He added color where none was needed, and certainty where memory always blurs. But the core of his outline matched what police had suspected. A shift from feuds to management had remade the underworld. That testimony altered the country's vocabulary. Newspapers printed diagrams of hierarchies beside photos of men in suits leaving courtrooms with hats pulled low. The phrase, "national syndicate," stopped sounding like a rumor. If that made the absent figure seem taller, it also made the target bigger for those who still kept offices with badges on the door. Prosecutors looked at ledgers with new intention, seeing in line items the contours of a shadow company. They realized something he had understood in the 20s. A stable illegal market relies on systems, not stunts. If you could prove the system existed and that someone profited from it, you could hold that person responsible for far more than a single bet or a single threat. The next 10 years tested that idea on a different front. Heroin flows, already anxieties in the 40s and 50s, began to dominate headlines. Investigators traced parcels from Marseille labs to Mediterranean docks, then across the Atlantic to couriers who distributed to neighborhood rings. The story became famous enough to inspire movies. For those who had chased him across decades, it was a grim echo of claims they had made. That networks he had once helped unify could carry anything that fit into a small package. He had denied involvement during his lifetime, telling anyone who listened that drugs brought heat that crushed every other business. His position did not end the argument. Seizures, arrests, and trials made it harder to dismiss the claim that transatlantic routes relied on old friendships and new greed. His absence, paradoxically, allowed both sides to insist they were right about him. While the streets and docks drew headlines, lawmakers went to their books and crafted a tool designed not for a lone thief, but for a structure of recurring activity. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a mouthful that boiled down to a simple premise. If you participated in an enterprise through a pattern of designated crimes, the enterprise and its leaders could be named and punished together. That shift, a legal mirror of the managerial shift he had introduced, would eventually set the stage for the most direct attack on the council idea since its birth. The irony did not go unnoticed by those who had studied his career. He had argued for centralization because it lowered violence and raised profits. Centralization also gave the state a single point to aim at once. It had the right statute and the patience to collect proof. His ghost surfaced again in 1975, when a book appeared promising his voice from beyond the grave. It carried the authority of a producer who had met him on the day he died and offered a version of events no court transcript could capture. In those pages, he supposedly owned plots, blessed trades he had denied in life, and gave an operator's tour of decades that had once been mostly rumor and courthouse whispers. A portion of the public accepted the book as scripture. Another portion, including tough-minded scholars and the lawmen who had built cases brick by brick, called it a confection part recollection, part second-hand lore, part invention. The argument over that volume became part of the argument over him. Maybe that was fitting. He had always thrived in the spaces where proof was scarce and myth loud. Meanwhile, the world he had shaped kept evolving. In New York, Carlo Gambino set a tone of patience after the barbershop headlines of 1957. Frank Costello lived in a hush until the 70s and died without a courtroom finale. Vito Genovese faded behind walls, a result that satisfied those who had tired of his appetite for force. Young leaders learned to treat unions as instruments rather than altars. In Las Vegas, properties that had once seemed like risky dreams turned into industries with corporate gloss. Pension funds, bank loans, and marketing men replaced quick cash and swagger in lobbies. It was the kind of transition he would have appreciated. The same revenue with fewer flares. The same leverage behind cleaner fronts. Yet even as portfolios matured, the underground economy still relied on the old triad. He had always balanced corruption where possible, negotiation where smart, pressure where necessary. One more chapter of his influence opened in a farmhouse upstate and closed in a federal courtroom downtown. The spectacle at Appalachian had exposed the membership list, but hadn't broken the organization. That would require a machine designed for patience. In the 80s, armed with RICO and fed by wiretaps, infiltrators, and records kept by the very accounting habits he had insisted on, prosecutors pulled together a case that treated the council itself as a defendant. The commission trial of 1985-86 put the top tier of New York's 5 families in one proceeding. Jurors heard about fixed construction bids, union pressure, skims from concrete contracts, and a committee that set policy for disputes and profit splits. Convictions landed. Sentences were long. It was as if the government had indicted a board of directors using the board minutes he would never have allowed to be written. Yet the signatures weren't needed. The pattern was the proof. At the same time, another sweeping case marched through a Manhattan courtroom with stacks of exhibits and interpreters at the ready. The Pizza Connection trial tied Sicilian traffickers and their American partners to a distribution system that moved narcotics under the cover of restaurants and food import businesses. The verdicts, reached after the longest criminal trial in U.S. history up to that point, convinced many voters that the international pipeline existed in exactly the way agents had described. To those who believed the book, it confirmed his supposed confessions. To those who distrusted the book but accepted the structure, it showed how a later generation, with different ethics and more appetite for heat, had used the architecture he left behind for a trade he had always claimed to oppose. Culture did its part to fix his silhouette in the public mind. Movies translated the underworld into family sagas and moral parables. A patriarch in one film combined traits from many real men. Old country manners, American appetite, business in the foreground, violence as a last resort. Viewers often assumed they were looking at him with the names changed. Later series marched back to the Prohibition years and drew his youth with elegance and ice. These portrayals captured one truth well. He was not a back-alley braggart, but a coordinator with a steady hand who used conversation as a tool. They missed or softened another truth. The cost of such coordination, measured in small businesses squeezed and workers turned into pawns, is not reduced because someone chooses a low voice over a shout. Back in Queens, his cemetery stone collected decades of weather. Tourists and students in bulky coats stopped by. Some whispered, as if noise would disturb a conference room 2 generations gone. Others read aloud the birth name, practicing the proper rhythm of the syllables. A few left coins. An older man from the neighborhood shook his head and told a younger friend that the Lower East Side once teemed with boys who wanted to be rich fast, and that only a few learned to make others do the lifting. The older man had no illusions about kindness. He talked about bar owners who paid for calm, about a garment contractor who had to add a cost of doing business line to every bid, about a foreman who slept easier after agreeing to a schedule set somewhere far from the factory floor. He said it with a shrug, the same gesture old New Yorkers use when they talk about snow. Inevitable, irritating, expensive. In Italy, files with his name moved from drawers to archives. Young officers assigned to the Naples police glanced through the pages and saw a careful routine. Check-ins logged to the minute, short detentions after high-profile crimes abroad, releases once the show of force had been staged. Their supervisors, who had watched him cross piazzas in immaculate coats, remembered a man who never raised his voice, who let others talk first, who kept to himself on days when he had nothing to gain from conversation. They would later tell their own students that the most effective figures in that world were the ones who treated time as a weapon and silence as a shelter. The scholars kept at it. Some focused on ledgers and dates and could tell you the exact day slot machines disappeared from one state or the hour a prosecutor walked into court with a box of marked bills. Others chased personalities and traced how a kid who bought safety for a nickel had turned into a man who sold it by the truckload. The best of them refused simple verdicts. They argued that he did two things at once. He reduced public mayhem during a time when it could have flooded the streets, and he built a financial system that extracted money from people who had no say in the rules. They added that his insistence on modernization had made law enforcement modernize too. He was both a problem and a teacher, the kind you don't invite but who still alters your thinking. What stayed consistent across the opinions was one practical point. He treated crime like a business. He pushed for lines of command, for territories, for conflict resolution methods that looked like contract clauses rather than oaths. He invested in relationships with politicians, union fixers, and police officers who preferred envelopes to confrontations. He preferred agreements to revenge, yet never flinched when a consequence needed to be delivered to preserve the message that agreements meant something. He kept meetings short, listened more than he spoke, and chose words the way a good tailor chooses thread strong enough to hold, invisible to the untrained eye. The tally of his crimes did not vanish in this analysis. Bootlegging gave him his first fortune. Illicit gambling kept him comfortable. Extortion protection. Money dressed as policy paid for more than suits. Labor racketeering turned warehouses and routes into toll booths. Corruption of public servants protected every link in the chain. The vice system that landed him in prison stood as the official reason for his fall. The accusations about narcotics never found a courtroom with him in the chair, but remained a shadow that lengthened after he died. He had said no to certain killings, like the plan to silence a prosecutor in the mid-30s, because the risk to the whole machine was too great. He had said yes to removals when he believed that leaders had become hazards to business. He had kept his fingers off guns and his name off receipts. He had built a map rather than a monument. You could measure his success by 3 hours on a random Tuesday in New York, any year from 1935 to 1955. Trucks arrived on time. Clubs opened at dusk. A judge ate dinner with a friend who happened to know a councilman. A small restaurant paid its envelope and got a new cooler installed by a union crew that didn't miss a day that month. A bookmaker took calls and logged bets in pencil. A foreman looked at a schedule and knew he wasn't going to be short-staffed because someone had settled a dispute 2 weeks earlier in a hotel suite. The city worked because someone had reduced sparks. It also worked because someone taxed the cost of reduced sparks. He had built that paradox and lived inside it with the same ease he displayed at a cafe table. Decades after his death, the shape he left behind remains visible, even when names have changed and laws have turned sharper. Corporate fronts grew more sophisticated. Politicians learned to avoid handshakes that might end up in photographs. Prosecutors learned to follow phone bills and seize assets. Unions, reformed in many corners and corrupted in others, stopped being the single switch that could stop a factory day. The underworld that succeeded him became less theatrical, more careful, and for a time, quieter in public. Then new generations, eager for speed and clumsy with restraint, rediscovered the costs of ignoring rules designed to minimize fireworks. Each cycle brought commentators back to the man under the cypress trees. His advocates called him a stabilizer. His critics called him a velvet-wrapped extortionist. Both descriptions point to something real. If you walk the Lower East Side on a late afternoon now, you could find a plaque where a tenement once stood and a cafe where a pushcart once parked. The languages in the air have changed shape, the hats have changed color, but the hunger is familiar. A kid with quick eyes might be working 2 jobs and learning 3 ways to keep trouble at bay. This city still breeds organizers, some with legal careers and some with schemes that live after midnight. He would recognize the tilt of a head that watches for angles and the rhythm of a block where favors trade hands. He would recognize, too, the cold math of what happens when a manager decides that everyone in a neighborhood owes a fee for the privilege of doing the ordinary things that make a life. He once said privately that luck is a story people tell to make sense of outcomes that were really the result of work, timing, and other people's mistakes. He had been called lucky as if bullets simply missed. He knew better. He had built a system that made it harder for bullets to fly, which is not the one nation with creation. Same as building a system that left people free. His calm hid fixtures that could not be seen until you tried to live without them. Envelopes on Mondays, calls at noon, a habit of keeping talk inside rooms where doors always opened to a second exit. Those fixtures outlived him. So did the debates about whether the city was better or worse for having known him. Snow gathered at the corners of headstones and melted into the grass. And somewhere a subway door chimed before sliding shut. The man in Queens had become a place on a map, yet the story kept breathing. In offices where the walls had seen every kind of bargain, his name still worked like a password to a time when the city's pulse fell into step because someone insisted on rhythm. Old policemen told younger ones that the files mattered more than rumors. Old bookmakers told younger ones that quiet mattered more than swagger. Across both camps, the lesson was the same. Order is a choice you keep making. In New York, the family he once steered no longer used his name. It wore another, inherited from the rival who had tried to crowd out the handshake school. That renaming fit the city's habit of turning personal feuds into labels that outlived their authors. Behind the label, the method looked familiar. Bosses learned to speak gently in public and firmly in rooms where curtains stayed shut. They preferred trusted messengers over grand meetings. They folded their own napkins and let others order the wine. The tone he'd set survived the names on the letterhead. When officers talked about him after he was gone, they argued over 2 points again and again. The first was the war years on the docks, the arrangement that calmed peers after a liner burned and a city panicked. Some said he flipped a switch. Others said the Navy's patrols and Union leaders' promises did most of the work. The truth lay somewhere between influence and logistics. He had a voice that could settle a rumor, and wartime bureaucrats found that useful. The second point was the claim that he had turned the Mediterranean into a highway for heroin. To some, the seizures and trials of later years spoke for themselves. To others, the lack of paper, the logic of his caution, and the distance of exile argued for another reading. He had said no to that trait in life. His shadow said yes, in stories told after. The argument never reached a clean conclusion. He had done enough without that chapter to fix his place in memory. As a young man, he treated prohibition like a shipping problem and built routes that made liquor arrive on time. When the taps turned legal again, he shifted to gambling the book in the back room, the dice in the hotel suite, the bright floor in a coastal resort, and he pushed partners to keep the books neat enough that skimming could be spotted and stopped. He bent unions to control trucks and docks, not to raise wages. He mastered city politics by paying to turn obstacles into delays, and delays into approvals. He established a system for keeping explosions off the front page, a council to arbitrate, borders to respect, and a quiet assumption that revenue divided regularly discourages revenge. He also crossed lines with a coolness that still unsettles. In 1931, 2 old-world kings vanished from the chessboard because he and his circle saw that their demands bled profit and invited anarchy. That year's tidy result, 5 fixed families, and an end to any single sovereign came out of decisions that cost lives. In 1935, when a volatile earner wanted a prosecutor dead, he argued the risk would ruin everything and helped sink the plan. That restraint did not spring from kindness. It came from cold math. In 1936, the state proved a case that put his name in a ledger of brothels and collections, and a jury did what rival gunmen never could. They removed him from the city he thought he had taught to listen. He served nearly 10 years before the docks, and a governor's pen carved a path out of a cell and into exile. After that, his days in Naples read like a manual for life under a permanent lamp. Wake early. Choose a corner table. Keep to schedules. Let others speak first. Meet in lobbies because doors there open in every direction. He built a second career in restraint, holding court without pretending to rule, steering visitors toward solutions that preserved agreements and dignity. His griefs lived quietly alongside the routine. He loved and lost, and the silence afterward hardened into habit. He made small promises to relatives and old friends and kept them. He collected maps as if tracing streets with a fingertip could keep his mind from wandering into rooms he could no longer enter. If you listen to the men who sat across from him over the years, you hear the same phrasing delivered in different accents. Keep your word. Don't force the police to act. Don't gamble with heat you can't handle. Don't make the city choose between you and itself. He thought of himself as a manager of weather. There would always be wind and rain. His job was to make sure the city could leave the house without an umbrella when it needed to. The price of that forecast fell on people who never sat in those rooms. The bar owner who paid the envelope because smashed glass cost more than pride. The seamstress whose hours were cut when a foreman had to meet a quota for workers he didn't need. The trucker who handed over a portion of his wage to pass through a gate that used to open for everyone. Long after his burial, the state learned to speak his language in order to argue with it. Prosecutors began to treat a family like a corporation, with predictable revenue streams and routines. The great trial that gathered top figures from multiple crews into one courtroom told a story he would have understood down to its punctuation. The products differed, but the system was the same: decisions made by a committee, territory assigned to avoid waste, disputes mediated, profits distributed. Guilty verdicts followed not because someone was caught with a briefcase full of money in a hotel lobby, but because the pattern proved itself over years. The law had modernized to match the machine he had installed. At the same time, the global case that traced powder through kitchens and storerooms to counters in neighborhoods where coffee and cash changed hands all day delivered a different lesson. The network could carry anything compact enough to hide and profitable enough to tempt. Some of the men who ran that network had grown up admiring the cool efficiency of the old architect. Whether he would have blessed their specific cargo remained the open question. The courts decided the facts they had. History still debates the rest. Around his story, the culture built its own monuments. Films and novels braided manners from one man, rules from another, and a face from a third. A patriarch stood in a garden and spoke about family. Another character in a different decade sat under a barber's sheet. A third smiled with ice in his eyes and counted cards as if they were votes. Viewers folded those scenes into their understanding and thought they had met the original. They had met a reflection composed of many parts. The central thread, the organizer who preferred clean meetings to noisy street theater, was his. The cost of that preference, the burden placed on people who never agreed to be governed, often arrived as a soft focus in those stories. The soft focus did not change the ledger. Walk back down the years, and you find a boy who learned that paying for protection was cheaper than fighting 10 strangers a week. He refined that lesson into an economy that covered entire neighborhoods. He put on better suits and traded fists for appointments and turned violence into the threat behind a curtain rather than the headline on the front page. He learned to make rivals cooperate, to convince men who hated each other's ancestry to see the sense in dividing roots and hours instead of funerals. He taught law enforcement to value accountants and clerks as much as detectives. He taught politicians that vague pledges of reform meant little if a union delegate could stop trucks on a Friday. He taught his peers that patience enriched them. He taught his enemies not to trust a season of calm. He taught everyone who watched that a city, at its busiest, is a negotiation. He left contradictions behind as neatly as he folded his shirts. He could be generous in private and ruthless in policy. He could protect a neighborhood from random bullies, and then send a collector to turn that same neighborhood into a monthly income statement. He could insist on no killing for show and still allow a removal when the math broke in only one direction. He took pride in teaching men not to waste lives for pride, and he did not waste time feeling sorry for people who paid bills they had no choice but to pay. His admirers call him a stabilizer. His critics call him a refined extortionist. Both speak parts of a whole. A quieter truth sits between those slogans. He understood that power, to last, must look like routine. He turned illegal markets into rituals envelopes on Mondays, calls at noon, meetings at 6, a final sweep before midnight to make sure everyone agreed on tomorrow's schedule. In that sense, he succeeded. The city ran because people got used to the rituals, even those who hated them. The law eventually learned to attack rituals rather than isolated acts. That was his unintended gift to his adversaries, a reason to study structures, a method for proving what had been considered a rumor. He had built something that could be seen if you knew which windows to look through. Sometimes at night, After the square emptied and the last tram rattled past, you could imagine him in that small apartment in Naples, the one with the view of a bay that reflected the moon like silver leaf. The maps were on a shelf. The letters were wrapped in ribbon. The suit for the morning was already chosen. He would stand for a while, lower the shade, and think about delivery times on a street 3,000 miles away where a baker set out panes of bread at dawn. He had been there once, early and often, and had learned the rhythm. He had modified it, taxed it, protected it, and sometimes saved it from men who preferred a crash to a compromise. He had also charged for that service without asking permission. That double fact order with a price never left him. It offers the only honest way to read his life. The last word belongs not to a courtroom or a movie, but to a worker locking a warehouse door on a winter evening in the mid-century city he shaped. The worker leans into the wind, collar up, thoughts on dinner, hardly conscious of the machinery that made his day start and end on time. That machinery included an office where cash moved without receipts, a hotel suite where two enemies changed the subject from revenge to margins, and a mantra that traveled across years and oceans. Keep the noise down, keep the calendar steady, keep promises enforceable. The worker does not love the arrangement. He does not choose it. He simply lives inside it, as millions did. The grave in Queens stays quiet. The city never does. Taxis hiss on wet avenues. Freight hits the docks before dawn. Judges write opinions that try to catch up to problems older than their robes. A man in a cafe a long time ago closes a newspaper and walks into the day. He leaves behind a design that others will copy, attack, praise, and curse. He leaves behind pain disguised as peace. He leaves behind a record that resists one-sentence verdicts. He leaves behind the simple, unsettling proof that a life can be both the map that makes a city easier to cross and the toll booth that charges everyone who passes. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Lucky Luciano here, thanking you for joining me on this quiet reflection of power, vision, and legacy. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Over 90% of our viewers watch but haven't subscribed yet, so if you enjoyed this one, your support truly helps us keep bringing more powerful tales to life. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.